Happy Monday, everybody. Hope you're all enjoying life and enjoying Magic the Gathering. Every Monday I go over my best of one, best of three meta review. Sometimes include a budget deck when I find them. And this week we still have the standard challenge on Magic the Gathering Online is being bugged, so we're not being able to see the actual deck lists from that, which is what I usually do to keep a track of what's going on in best of three. So hopefully that gets fixed soon, and at least by Bloomborough, which will be coming here near the end of the month and the first week of August. So we're going to start things off then with just best of one and keep things a little shorter than usual. So just on a quick side note, I'd like to say thank you for all joining me in this community that's being built. It's really rewarding. I just hit 1,000 views a day for 90 days, which has always been a little bit of a milestone that I've been kind of setting out since I started streaming back in 2020. So anyway, with that, let's get started. So first thing here is I like to use a tracker called Untapped. And this way I can kind of remove my bias. So the tracker just looks at what is winning the most games for all players, bronze to mythic. So it's not specifically to a certain meta, it's just what's working for the most amount of people. And this week the number one spot goes to Boros Humans, and if we compare this one to the last week, we can see a couple of changes. So the reason why I'm going to talk about the changes is because if you're new and returning to Magic the Gathering, if the cards are being pulled out or added in, then they're kind of in the flex spots of the deck and aren't considered part of the core. So Boros Humans is a lot like Mono White Humans. It's similar to Boros Convoke, but is ditching the Gleeful Demolition, so you don't have a turn 2 Knight Errant of Eos. The upside, though, is you get to play some of the cards that you only see in the Mono White Human space, like Adeline, Resplendent Cathar, and then Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, is often not included in the Boros Convoke lists, although occasionally you do see it. So this week, though, we're dropping one copy of Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, 2 copies of the Brutal Cathar, so getting rid of those entirely, and 2 copies of the Sanguine Evangelist, which is the one that spawns the 1/1 that has the battle cry when it attacks, and spawns a 1/1 when it dies. And instead, we're running an additional copy of Adeline, Resplendent Cathar, and 2 copies of the Lunarch Veteran. So both of these cards are really good for the mono red. The 4 toughness can be difficult for mono red to get over, and then the life gain that you get off of Lunarch Veteran from 1/1s entering off of Adeline every turn and just generally playing a creature every turn can help you get out of range of the mono red Prowess builds. And then we're also running 2 copies of the Intrepid Adversary. Similarly, this lifelink is something that can be problematic for mono red to race. And then you can also use it as a board pump to give everything +1/+1 if you cast it for 4 or 6 or 8. The effect stacks and works at pumping your entire board. And then we've got 2 copies of the Case of the Gateway Express, and this is a card that you usually see in Boros Convoke, and I like its inclusion here over Ossification, which is kind of the Brutal Cathar spot, or Ossification. This is the only point removal that the deck has, so save the Case of the Gateway Express for a problematic threat that you can't get over, specifically something that has higher than 4 toughness a lot of the time. And then as far as the lands go, we're dropping 2 Secluded Courtyards and 1 Mirrex to bring in a Inspiring Vantage. And so if you go back and you look at the Boros Humans list that I was running, I dropped the Plains instead and brought in the Intrepid Adversaries. I definitely agree with the 22 lands. Dropping the 2 Secluded Courtyards makes it a little bit harder to cast your Imidane's Recruiter, but a lot of times you're not casting this on turn 3 because you want to cast this when you're swinging in for lethal, at least ideally. Next up, number 2, according to Untapped, was Mono Red Prowess. And we've seen some version of Mono Red Prowess, whether it's Gruul Aggro or Rakdos Aggro, or even Izzet with a Shore Up and such. It's all based off of Slickshot Show Off, and so being able to play cheap 1-costed spells, you can hit for an incredible amount of damage with the Slickshot Show Off. And so similarly, if we compare this to last week, we can see that we've dropped 1 copy of the Godric Cloaked Reveler and brought in 1 copy of the Bloodthirsty Adversary. We kind of see this one come and go. It gives it a little bit more of an option if you are flooding out and could be replaced with like a Feldon. But I like the Bloodthirsty Adversary because it does give you an answer if you have more lands. And we're also dropping, bringing in an additional Fugitive Codebreaker. This allows you to either play it out as a 2/1 Prowess Haste. Most of the time, that's what you're doing. But if it's later in the game, you can play it out as a disguised creature for 3 colorless, and then flip it. And if you have 5 instances or sorceries in your graveyard, it only costs 1 red to flip. And then if you do that and your hand is empty, then you just draw 3 cards. So it's a way to kind of refuel later in the game, and also just being an early threat that works with the prowess synergy of the rest of the deck. And we're bringing in 1 Phyrexian Dragon Engine, and this is kind of like instead of the 3rd Godric. And I really like this inclusion. You've got a double strike, which works kind of like the Picnic Ruiners that we see a lot of times in the Rakdos aggro space. Because being able to put a combat trick like Monstrous Rage or Antagonize or the other like combat spells work really well with the double strike. But then it also gives you that option of giving you additional dig. So when it enters the battlefield from your graveyard, you may discard your hand if you do draw 3 cards. And because everything is so cheap, it's not uncommon for you to be able to get through your whole hand. And so this gives us another way of kind of refueling our hand later in the game. So several signals here that mono red is trying to extend the game if your opponent is able to shut down the 1-turn kill off of the Slick Shot Show Off. And to make room for this, we're dropping the shocks down to 2. So we've got Play with Fire and Shock. And also keep in mind that rotation is coming in August 2nd. So some of these cards like Play with Fire and Kumano Faces Kakazan are going to be rotating out. So if you are new and returning, I would probably hold off for a month just to see how rotation kind of shakes things up. I do have a video that talks about my top 5 budget decks, though, that look like they're going to be good for rotation, as best as I can guess, right? And then also the lands here, we're dropping or including a Sokanzan over a mountain. I think the previous list was running just 18 mountains. Third on the list is Boros Convoke, and this one is an older build that we covered a couple of weeks ago that is running a little bit more heavily teched against mono red. So we're bringing in the 2 Lunarch Veterans, we're cutting the Yoshin Frontliner, we're bringing in the Sanguine Evangelist, and to make room for this, we're dropping 1 Case of the Gateway Express, as well as 3 copies of the War Leader's Call to bring in the 2 copies of Lightning Helix. And what this really signifies to me is a decrease in the control decks, and I think we're going to see a couple of builds this week from the tracker that kind of look like maybe Azorius Control has dipped down a little bit in popularity, because the War Leader's Call is really good for inevitably closing out the game against your more grindy decks. And the Lightning Helix, though, giving you that instant speed interaction to be able to shoot Slick Shot Show Off and get you some life stabilization. And we also see some slight tweaks to the land, so we're dropping the Agonjo as well as the Sokanzan. Sometimes you see these go up to 2. This one's running an additional copy of Mirix, as well as my least favorite card in the archetype, 2 copies of Sundown Pass. Number 4 on the list is Mono White Humans. And so I forgot to mention, because I already talked about it, in that previous list, what you're trying to do is use something that creates a token and then Gleeful Demolition to get a turn 2 Knight Errant of Eos. Because if you can get 5 things on the board and one of them's a white creature, then you can convoke for 5 and get the Knight Errant of Eos out. This deck is not doing that. So this is very similar to what we talked about with Boros Humans. And instead of, we're not bringing in the additional Secluded Courtyard to be able to cast the Imidane's Recruiter, but is leaning more heavily into the Adeline and Thalia and Coppercoat Vanguard strategies. So what we're seeing right now is that just a lot of the top performing decks are very board flooding strategies, right? So I think this is a pretty good week if you are an Azorius Control player to start bringing in some more of those cheap sweepers, running 4 temporary lockdowns, for example. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later when we get to Azorius Control. So this is the OG build, the original build of Mono White Humans. For several weeks, we saw the one that was running the Phyrexian Vindicator performing better, and that was largely because there were less sweepers in the meta. So anytime that there's less sweepers, then this deck, like Boros Convoke, rebuilds from a sweeper like Temporary Lockdown or Depopulate or Sunfall better than the version that was running the Phyrexian Vindicator. Now, it is so we're tweaking away, so we're removing the 4 copies of the Hopeful Initiate and the 4 copies of the Guardian of New Benalia. And Guardian of New Benalia is better when there's less temporary lockdowns, right? So if your opponent is using single point removal to counter the Slickshot Show-Offs and mono red Prowess, then as long as it's not an exile effect, like if it's black removal like Cut Downs or Go for the Throat, then Guardian of New Benalia is really good because if they target it, you can give it indestructible. Now, if they're playing temporary lockdown, then not so much, right? The other thing too is we see the Intrepid Adversaries being dropped down from 4 to 2, and this one's particularly good against mono red. And we see 1 less Thalia, Guardian of Thraben. This is another one that kind of signals to me that at least this last week there was less Azorius Control. And then we've also dropped 1 less Brutal Cathar. And bringing in the 4 Lunarch Veterans, this kind of helps stabilize against the mono red. And bringing back the 2 Skrelv. And this is really nice for protecting your Thalia and your Coppercoat Vanguard. And from the single point interaction. And then we've got the Warden of the Inner Sky, which allows us to pump off of our board and scry. And when we've got the 3 copies of the Resolute Reinforcements. So similar to Boros Convoke, we're still taking advantage of going wide and convoking off of the Knight Errant of Eos, but a little bit less so than the Boros Convoke space, but it's still there. And we're also dropping the Elspeth Smite and the March of Otherworldly Light. The Elspeth Smite and March of Otherworldly Light were really good tech builds specifically for Boros Convoke and mono red Prowess. So the Elspeth Smite being able to shoot the Slickshot and the March of Otherworldly Light being able to blow up the Gleeful Demolition target. And so we're moving further away from that original build and back towards the ossification. And as far as the lands go, we've dropped in a Gonjo and 4 Plains and brought in the 4 Cavern of Souls and 1 Mishra's Foundry. So it's not like Azorius Control is not there at all, right? I mean, like the Cavern of Souls helps you be able to get your humans down onto the battlefield without it being countered. And 5th up on the list is mono red Aggro. And mono red Aggro traditionally is similar to mono red Prowess, but tends to drop some of the Prowess threats, especially like Ancestral Anger, to go for a little bit more of a mid-game strategy to extend a little bit if your opponent has an answer like single point interaction for the Slickshot Show-Off. So they're very similar, but they do have enough of a difference in their matchups that they're considered different archetypes, even though they're both mono red and have a very low aggressive curve. And so if I compare this one to last week, we can see we've dropped the 4 copies of the Phoenix Chick. A lot of times you see the Phoenix Chicks get dropped in best of 3. And we're dropping the 1 copy of Squee. Again, Phoenix Chick and Squee go really well together because Squee helps you go wide, which then allows you to bring back the Phoenix Chicks. And instead we're running 2 copies of Godric Cloaked Reveler. And this is really because we're also going to be bringing in a synergy piece for the Godric Cloaked Reveler. And we're dropping the 2 copies of Urbrask's Forge. Again, another sign, I think, that kind of points to there being less Azorius Control and maybe Temur Control in the meta. And 3 copies of Witchstalker's Frenzy. And instead of running 2 copies of Shock and 4 copies of the Demonic Ruckus, this one being particularly good against Boros Convoke, being able to give even your Swift Spears and your Fugitive Codebreakers Menace, makes it easier to get through the chump blockers that Boros Convoke has. Also, the Sanguine Evangelist spawns a 1/1 flyer, so if you're able to give the Slickshot Show-Off Menace, then they can't chump block with their 1/1 bat. And we've also, but the new card that's really coming up this week that I haven't seen for quite some time is Invasion of Tarkir. And it's a battle that deals 2 damage plus X, where X is the number of revealed dragons. So there are no dragons in this list. Sometimes mono red will be running like the Shivan Devastator. Usually you see one of those being included more in best of 3. But in this list, we've got Invasion of Tarkir, which is just going to do the 2 damage to any target. But then if you attack it, you can then flip over a 4/4 flying trampled and whenever it attacks, it deals 2 damage to any target. Now, Godric can celebrate and turn into a dragon that then has fire breathing that gives all of your dragons you control +1/+0. So if you do flip the battle, then whenever dragon you control attacks, which if you celebrate, this will be a dragon as well, right? So you can end up hitting everything for two damage twice to any target, and then also fire breathing for your flying dragons. So it's a way to kind of go a little bit later. And I really think the inclusion here is to improve the matchup of mono red aggro against mono red prowess, because mono red prowess tends to be a little bit faster, and then mono red aggro is unfavored in that matchup. But if by going a little bit later and especially blocking the air with the 4/4 flyer makes it harder for them to get their slick shot show off through for lethal. And then as far as the lands go, we've brought in a Sokenzon, or no, dropped a Sokenzon and a Mishra's Foundry to go down to a total of 19 lands instead of 21, because we're kind of lowering the curve by bringing out the Urabrask's Forge. And that's it for aggro. And now we actually get to talk about what's going on in control. So number 6 this week was Temur Control. And I haven't talked about Temur Control specifically in Best of 1 since week 5 of Outlaws of Thunder Junction. So we have to go back almost 2 months, unless I missed it in my notes. But we see very little being changed to the archetype, so this one is deciding to not run the Colossal Sky Turtle, which I like if there's more Boros Convoke in the meta, and I've been bumping into a lot of Boros Convoke, so I was kind of curious to see that one changed. But we're also dropping 1 copy of the World Soul's Rage. A lot of times you see this fluctuate between 3 and 4, and then we're bringing in an additional Spelunking, which allows us to the sack lands in this archetype that are gaining us life when the land that it goes and fetches usually comes into play tapped. If you have Spelunking, it comes into play untapped, and you can immediately use it, and it allows you to really pop off with Nissa Resurgent Animist as well. And for the lands, we've got an additional copy of Echoing Deeps. Back in week 5, the list I was talking about had dropped the Echoing Deeps to go to 29 lands, and we're back up to 30 for this one. And but yeah, you're trying to stabilize, you're using Fires of Victory for instant speed interaction, and then you're trying to stabilize through the life gain of your sack lands, bring them all back with Aftermath Analyst to further ramp you. You can do the World Soul's Rage for ramp, and then also as a finisher. Usually you win the game by hitting them for 20 damage to the face with World Soul's Rage, especially after you've made your lands tap for more with the Virtue of Strength. And the reason the Colossal Sky Turtle was included with Shigeki to give you kind of an infinite board loop. And so we're dropping that. And the bounce effect of the Colossal Sky Turtle is where I have found it to be handy installing. All right, number 7 is Azorius Control. And this one we've seen time and time again in the top 8. And no, at this point, I've talked a lot about these decks that are in the top 8, but every week there's always somebody who's like, well, I just came back to Magic and I really found it helpful that you were talking through everything, so I do it every week. I do think there's some interesting stuff that happened in Azorius Control this week, though. So we see that the 2 copies of the Tishana's Tidebinder got dropped, which is, again, another signal that maybe Azorius Control overall was a less popular pick, because the Tishana's Tidebinder can silence the Planeswalkers of Azorius Control. We've also dropped the 1 copy of Jace, the Perfected Mind, in the Planeswalker slot. That's another sign that Azorius Control might be less, because Jace, the Perfected Mind, is best in the mirror match, where it often goes to mill, and is a very grindy matchup. We're also dropping the 4 copies of Deduce, and Deduce is a card that you usually hold up a counterspell, and then if your opponent is playing around the counterspell, you cast Deduce instead at the end of their turn. And so I think what we're seeing is more decks that are likely to just play strictly into the counterspells instead of around them. Aggro can't afford to play around the counterspell as much as like a mid-range or another control deck can. And so we're seeing basically, more counterspells being brought in. And then we've also dropped or tweaked the amount of Wraths in the deck. So we're dropping the 1 Depopulate, we're dropping 1 Sunfall, running a single copy of the Sunfall here, and then dropping 1 Farewell. And instead we're bringing in the 4th copy of the March of Otherworldly Light. As I mentioned, this card is particularly good for getting rid of the target for Gleeful Demolition and preventing the turn 2 Knight Errant of Eos in Boros Convoke. And by blowing up the artifact that's targeted, and bringing in 4 copies of the Phantom Interference. Again, I think this is because these 12 counterspells are just more likely that your opponent isn't going to be playing around you holding up the counterspell. Bringing in an additional copy of Get Lost. I really like Get Lost, especially when you're not up against a matchup that is going to take advantage of the value of getting the map tokens. And we're also going to be bringing in 2 additional copies of the Temporary Lockdown. So like I said, if Boros Convoke is really popular, then we can run full 4 copies of Temporary Lockdown. The reason why it goes down to 2 is because this is a dead card when you're up against other Azorius Control decks. And then we're also bringing in 3 copies of the Final Showdown, which is the Wrath that we got in Outlaws of Thunder Junction. And it's a little bit more expensive. It's kind of like Farewells if you really want to do the whole shebang, because for 3 triple pip white, you destroy all creatures. And then for 4 triple pip white, you destroy all creatures, and then one of them gets indestructible. But you can also use it for any of the options by paying the spree cost. And so it gives you some flexibility. And really curious to see how Final Showdown performs and whether or not we're going to see it continue into rotation, or if we're going to go back to some of the more preferred Wraths that are less expensive if we do see a rise in control again. And as far as the lands go, we've brought in a full playset of Mirrex and dropped the 2 copies of A Darker Waste and 3 copies of Seachrome Coast. So this deck is running 26 lands instead of 27. Personally, when I play Control, I like 27 or even 28 lands because you really don't want to miss your land drops. But again, that is usually because you want to have the 28 lands when you're in a Control versus Control meta. So the more likely that you're playing up against Aggro and Boros Convoke, then it's less important that you have the 27 and the 28 lands. And the third deck that's kind of like all 3 of these last decks are control decks, and they're typically seen more often in best of 3 than they are in the best of 1, this best of 1 space. The reason for that is because the best of 1 decks, the best of 1 uses a hand smoother. So it was developed by Ryan Spain, and I actually know Ryan Spain, hanging out in their stream a lot. They quit streaming Magic, but it was a lot of fun while it lasted. But the idea basically that Arena does free mulligans that the player does not see, and then gives you the best hand of those free mulligans to kind of encourage there being less non-games of not hitting your lands. So like when you play best of 3, you'll start with lands where you have 0 lands in hand. That practically never happens in best of 1 because of the best of 1 hand smoother. Now, it improves the overall experience for new players by lowering the amount of non-games due to mana variance. But it also kind of came at a cost of making aggro a better overall, because you can afford to run a lower than average, statistically speaking, number of lands and still be okay, because those free mulligans are then going to encourage you to start your hand with 2 lands, even if you normally wouldn't in best of 3. So keep that in mind if you're used to playing in paper, that Arena works a little bit differently in best of 1. If you don't want the hand smoother, play in best of 3, and there no shenanigans are going on. With that being said, though, the last list here is number 8 was Domain, and this is one that is going to be tricky because we're losing a lot of the triomes. So these lands that came in Streets of New Capenna are rotating out in August 2nd. And it's hard to say whether or not Domain will exist if the triomes go away. Now, they've printed the triome lands every 2 years. They were first printed in Ikoria, then in Streets of New Capenna in 2022. So it's possible that this year that they're going to bring back the triome lands. And if they do that, then Domain will survive. I think without the triome lands, that Domain is definitely at least going to suffer. So this is kind of the last time to get those reps in with Domain if you love the archetype. And during Outlaws of Thunder Junction, we did see a shift in leaning more towards the Ancient Cornucopia and the Ill-Timed Explosion, which this list is not running, and the Lightning Helixes, to give us some life stabilization while we stall to hit Sunfall and then eventually win the game with Herd Migration and Atraxa. So with that, remember to click like and subscribe if you like this sort of thing. I do try to make daily Magic the Gathering videos, although I might have to step back a little bit this month, just depending on my schedule. I would like to do some backpacking, and it's difficult to do daily videos while doing so. So welcome to my community if you're new here. Feel free to leave me any questions in the comments. I always love hearing back from you guys. And good luck killing it in the last season of Outlaws of Thunder Junction.